Now on Channel 4, the 60s, the decade when the motor car became accessible to us all, and tower blocks rose almost as a sign of optimism for the future.
Cars were incredibly important in the mid-60s because they performed two functions. One, they were a visible measure of your success at that time, and two, by virtue of going for a really outlandish car, you actually could cut across class barriers that had never before been severed. So by owning a Rolls, which up until then only lords could have, you really kind of were able to express something that you'd managed to achieve.
Baby, you can drive my car. Yes, I'm gonna be a star. Baby, you can drive my car. And baby, I love you. I told that girl that my prospects were good. And she said, baby, it's understood. Working for peanuts is all very fine, but I can show you a better time. Baby.
In the 60s, one of the best places to be was behind the wheel of an E-type Jag. From here, the new high-rise offices, the tower blocks, the motorways were like a film set for your personal fantasy. A new world was being constructed to accommodate the internal combustion engine. And even if your E-type looked more like a Mini, it was still your world.
In 1959, this car behind me came onto the market. And it gave the English for the first time access to a car at the same level that Hitler gave the Volkswagen to the Germans. And I bought one of these, firstly because, as I say, it was cheap. It was a 5-seater, believe it or not. It was very economical on fuel.
And we're off. But tell me one thing, what's Dad reminding them about? Why, those days before the new baby Austin came into their lives. It's different now as they set out for a family holiday on the continent.
The liberation was a tremendous and exciting thing. Great deal of sacrifice to own your first car, but I think everyone agreed that their affection for the vehicle was tremendous. I remember one guy describing his motor car to me once as his mistress with synchro mesh, and I think that typifies the attitude of the men of the 60s who for the first time could find this personal mobility and all it meant to their way of life.
Between 1957 and 1962, new car sales nearly doubled. People had money to burn, and it burned best underneath the bonnet of a car.
The friendly car. Its function, a means of transport for family units, bringing people together, linking friends and relations. Something safely domestic, like the fridge or the washing machine. The object of veneration in suburban avenues on Sunday morning. An indispensable utility for all but the poorest. An object of affection, a member of the family. The good car, cherished and loved by all.
think this was very much the era in which we measured out our life in the accumulation of consumer durables. A car, television set, washing machine, fridge. These were sort of milestones by which you charted your progress through life. What I think we didn't realise then, but is now very clear, is that some of these, particularly television and the motor car, had all sorts of implications beyond what was originally thought. If we take television, this was of course the era when ITV came in, so television for the first time became a real marketing tool. Now in doing that it created a national market for all sorts of products which didn't exist before, but it also created expectations, enlarged people's horizons, made people see how the other half lived.
Getaway people, drive safely always. Getaway people get Super National.
To some extent this created a rod for our backs because we weren't able to satisfy all those expectations. Now in the case of the car, of course, that had even wider, I think, implications. Made people very much more mobile, they had a much wider range of choice as to where they lived, how far they commuted into work, and so on. And in so doing, of course, it created all sorts of problems for the cities which at the time we weren't aware of or only very dimly aware of.
The Second World War not only smashed the cities, for thousands of people it showed a world beyond their immediate horizons. Places that could easily be reached in a lorry, a jeep, a Morris Minor or a Ford Anglia. Post-war reconstruction meant new houses and new roads.
The years immediately after the war were very exciting because there were two great developments coming along. One was the construction of the new towns, and the other, of course, was restoring the bombed-out cities. And these two huge tasks, I think, gave everybody a sense of optimism, a feeling that the reconstruction of the country wouldn't just stop at those projects, and we'd be able to go on and rebuild the cities and rebuild the transport system. And certainly, in my own case, when I came back after the war, out of the army and joined the Ministry of Transport, I myself really felt that within 20 years we would have the country rebuilt.
The 20th century has really only had two ideas about cities. One is the garden city, which isn't really a city at all, but a kind of giant suburban village. The other is what I suppose you have to call the city of towers, which never has had a proper name because it's a kind of folk vision of the city of the future. Tower blocks, shiny glass towers for preference, and multi-level circulation, traffic on all different levels going round the feet of the towers. Here in London, the only place you can really see it is here at the junction of Tottenham Court Road and Euston Road. It really looks quite like the diagrams that Le Corbusier drew then.
Hot town, summer in the city, back of my neck getting dirty and gritty. Stand down, isn't it a pity? Doesn't seem to be a shadow in the city. All around, people looking half dead, walking on the sidewalk harder than a match.
These could be drawings of any modern city centre. But what's that biplane doing there? Drawings that the French architect Le Corbusier made in the 20s and 30s fired the imagination of the 50s and 60s. High-rise blocks do make beautiful images. Clean lines, strong geometric shapes. There's no weather in drawings, no shadows, no noise, and the lift never gets stuck.
No half measures about Glasgow housing. Everything's looking up at the Ballinlough development. On the 22-acre site are the highest residential flats in Europe. 4,500 people will soon have a pilot's eye view of their great city and enjoy it in modern comfort. Glasgow authorities have tackled a tremendous problem boldly and with imagination. The cost so far, more than £6 million.
One of the most important points about 60s planning is that it was conceived in terms of the car. everyone was going to have a car. The phrase was universal car ownership and universal mobility. And you had to provide for that, and everything was seen from the point of view of the car driver or the future car driver.
50 years ago, cars were a hand-built luxury. Today, they're a mass-produced commodity. And last year, Britain built more than 700,000 of them. Over 370,000 were for the home market. If driven bumper to bumper, they'd stretch for nearly 1,000 miles, roughly from Land's End to John O'Groats. Nowadays, who can be king of the road? For the open road is virtually no more. Other countries have tackled their traffic problems. Perhaps we can learn something from them. America has many more cars, but they've got a lot more room to play around in. And they're not hampered by an antiquated road system. They've built from scratch, and they've built big. Magnificent motorways designed to carry through traffic quickly and safely.
There was a very fundamental belief in the 60s in a scientific approach to planning. The jargon word was the systems approach. Systems, of course, went through everything and were the basis of everything at that time. The space program and the jargon inherited from the space program very much underlay activities in planning and management generally, and certainly in the physical planning of towns and cities. It was almost as if the engineers, in particular the traffic engineers, took over planning.
It wasn't just any old traffic engineers either. No project was complete without an American consultant who knew all about interstate highways. To the 60s planner, public transport was an irritation, walking was for lunatics. In 1962, the projected traffic flows for this road to Earl's Court in London would have demanded a 14-lane throughway. It never happened, but the lust for tarmac had to be satisfied.
M1, Britain's first motorway, is the beginning of a new deal for drivers on the country's alarmingly congested roads. Linking London and Birmingham, it offers a high-speed, time-saving route. Incidentally, it's said to be the longest stretch of new road built in Britain since the Roman occupation. And the new Minister of Transport, Mr. Ernest Marples, was there to open it.
Now, sir, this motorway starts a new era in road travel. It is in keeping with the bold, exciting, and scientific age in which we live. Now, therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I declare the road open.
A small ceremony, but a big event. And traffic was soon taking this opportunity of trying out a new experience in British road travel. A new experience, yes, but of course not every car is in condition for sustained high speed. Not every driver realizes just what it implies.
Oh, you can go as fast as you like, you know. It's just, it's not driving, it's just sitting there, isn't it?
Quite fantastic, as a matter of fact. I just didn't know how fast I was going. You just keep on wanting to go faster and faster. You just can't help it.
It will bring immense benefits if drivers use discipline, common sense, and obey the rules. But disaster and tragedy may descend on those who drive recklessly or selfishly. For on this magnificent road, the speed which can easily be reached is so great that senses may be numbed and judgment warped.
The main criticism is that it seems to be built for the present rather than the future. 2 lanes of traffic limits the sort of the possibility of the road for the future. I mean, in America, of course, they have 6-lane traffic, and if you have 3 or 4 lanes, you can have further segregation of traffic into faster and slower streams.
And it can be made into 3-lane, but you feel it should be even more.
I think, well, I understand they've provided for 3 lanes, but I really think it ought to be more.
In the early 60s, nearly 1 in 20 people worked in jobs related to the car industry. The industry, together with the road hauliers, the AA and the RAC, made a powerful parliamentary lobby, pushing for more motorways.
The northern suburbs of Birmingham, the M6-M1 link well on its way, and the Gravelly Hill multi-level intersection progressing on schedule. 2¼ years, with construction at various stages, spread over 30 acres, 10 involving existing property, 18 separate lanes, 5 different levels, viaducts carrying roads over the complex of river and canal. And through the apparent tangle of concrete...
The phrase used was opening up the country, blazing a trail through the Warwickshire rainforests to reach the lost tribes of Northumberland. By the early 70s, we had what looked like a comprehensive motorway system. The grand plan was never completed. The money ran out well before that, but it took you from point A to point B. The man who took us from city to city was Ernest Marples, but there was a problem inside the cities with so many cars.
And this is where I began to come into the picture, because he, I think, was able to understand most of the advice he was getting about what ought to be done for railways, coastal shipping, and so on. But when he came to ask about urban traffic, he could get no advice at all. He could see that we needed a motorway program put properly on the road, but he couldn't find any coherent philosophy about traffic in towns and all its problems.
This group has now come out with this report, and if anyone can tell us what the problems of the next 50 years are going to be, and what the solution is likely to be, surely Mr. Buchanan should be the man to do it. There are now 10 million motor vehicles in our country. But by 1970, there'll be 18 million. It's an awful fact, but we have to accept it. By 1980, there'll be 27 million.
In fact, there were only 20 million. Statisticians got their sums wrong, and they didn't anticipate the pill.
By the year 2010, it's reckoned that everyone in the nation who wants a car will have one. That's to say, about 40 million vehicles. Britain is going to be exactly the same size place with 4 times the number of vehicles in it. What in fact is going to happen? Are the cars going to take over? We can't disinvent the motor car. Society accepts it and doesn't want to be rid of it. And why should we? Is it humanly possible to keep that usefulness and convenience without being tyrannized by it?
The whole country, ever since the motor vehicle appeared on the scene before the First War, has been laid out on the basis of the motor vehicle as the central method of transport. And when we looked at the relative proportions of traffic, both of passengers and goods carried by road and rail, it was quite clear that it wasn't just a marginal difference. The great preponderance of traffic was carried by road. We couldn't see how this was going to disappear. So we decided that it would stay with us as long as could be foreseen ahead.
We chose this block of central London north of Oxford Street as a typical heavily built-up area with a great variety of uses and acute traffic problems. Our first objective was to find out what advantages there would be from redeveloping the whole area completely. What sort of environment could be recreated for the people who live and work there now, and how much traffic would it take?
The Traffic in Towns report proposed a series of theoretical options for development. Anything from just knocking things about a bit to total destruction and rebuilding. A 6-lane motorway for the Tottenham Court Road, for instance.
Even so, this system could deal with something like 12,000 vehicles an hour at the evening rush hour. The only way in which we could put back into the area all the accommodation and activities that are there now, and cater for all the traffic, was by inserting a completely new level for living, a building deck 20 feet above the present ground level. It would be liberally pierced to let in air and light to the traffic roads underneath, and to give vistas and views both for the drivers below and the pedestrians above.
There was no doubt at all that the pedestrians above would love their vistas and views, and Peter and Jane would have fun on the bus in their bright new colouring book world. The conclusion of the report was clear and universally accepted. We'd either have to accept less cars, or if we wanted cars in the number being predicted, we'd have to spend vast sums on roads and redevelopment.
About 60% of the demand for shopping. Conditions would be infinitely better than they are now. All the existing facilities would be replaced with the addition of other things, such as a primary school and pleasant open spaces which are not there at present.
I think it's very doubtful whether the environmental problems could have been solved even if you'd spent the kinds of money suggested by his illustrations in his report. The actual knocking down of towns to fit in the roads is an environmental problem, and even when you'd done that, you'd had these powerful networks and people living fairly close to them and so on and so forth. And the other great weakness at the conceptual level was what he meant by accessibility. Now, what he meant was really the freedom to use the car. Now, there's certainly a conflict between the freedom to use a car and the environment, but there's also a conflict between the freedom to use a car and mobility in some wider sense. That is to say, the ability to get around on foot, by bicycle, by bus, and so on. Too much traffic not only creates the environmental problems, it creates mobility problems. And that, unfortunately, is what Buchanan didn't see because of this very narrow concept he had of accessibility. And it's taken a very long time to get that message across. In fact, we're still suffering from an inappropriate concept of mobility.
As well as the Buchanan report, in 1963, another major report on transport was published, the Beeching Report on the Railways. At a time when spending on roads was seen as a sound investment in the future, spending on railways was seen as bailing out a loss maker, an antiquated relic of the Victorian past.
Dr. Beeching's diagnosis and prescription are going to affect everybody. He's a reticent man, but he's already made it quite clear what form his cure will take. Fewer stations, fewer branch lines, fewer stopping trains even on the main lines, and fewer depots for handling freight. Inevitably, fares will go up again, and more railwaymen are bound to find themselves no longer needed. The losses which Dr. Beeching has brought in to cut are colossal. Last year, £170 million. So it's generally expected that the cuts in the services will be on the same massive scale.
The cuts were indeed massive, something like a third of the systems. The worst affected were country areas, little branch lines and village stations. People in such areas were given the option of buying a car or staying at home.
Here at Policy Studies Institute, we carried out a study 2 or 3 years ago into the social consequences of these rail closures, and we found that far from being reconciled to the withdrawal of these rail services, the public in the 10 areas that we examined were extremely unhappy about the loss of these services. They found that the bus services that had been put on to replace the rail services were far less adequate in terms of convenience and comfort than the previous rail services, and one could see the effect of this in terms of the impact on their activity. Over 70% of the respondents said that their activity was reduced as a consequence of the closure of the railways.
By courtesy of your minister, you are free to tear a motorway strip through Britain. 508 miles now completed for your relaxation and convenience.
In the motorway age, the glamour of the Orient Express had been pushed aside. Glamour could only be found in the fast lane, the wide open spaces where a man could do what a man had to do, and to hell with the problems of station closures, compulsory purchase, and urban redevelopment.
Veer left at a non-existent junction south of Leeds on the M1. Destroy houses, factories, churches, schools.
One of the big arenas for planning action in the 60s was the big cities of the Midlands and North and Scotland, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds, Newcastle, Glasgow, because there, of course, you had a horrendous legacy of Victorian slumdom, 88,000 houses declared unfit for habitation in Liverpool, 68,000 in Manchester, for instance, and going with it the whole legacy of Victorian roads, Victorian shops, Victorian everything. that seemed as if it had to be swept away by the bulldozer almost overnight. And the money was pouring in from central government in the form of subsidies to clear slums, subsidies to build new motorways, and so on.
It's all right just talking about this so-called attitude of the Northerner. We're accustomed to it, we live with it, and therefore we can stand it. Well, the point is, how much longer can we stand it? I mean, imagine at the North where we're at, we accept it, we live with it. Well, we can't live with it much longer. I mean, how can you expect a southerner or someone from the Midlands to come up here and say, right, I might want to live here? Is it possible for me to live here?
What strikes me immediately when you come up into the north, you come through the industrial areas of the Midlands, and you come up into the north up here, and you see the industrial housing, that it is ultimate. It's row upon row of red brick terraced housing, most of it back-to-back housing. All things done in brick, red brick, the same thing all the time.
It's madness when you consider the structure and the sanitation and these sort of technological things. This is madness, yes. The appearance is to some extent madness, but it can be greatly improved.
Leeds did, in fact, have one of the worst problems with slum housing in the country, in spite of the fact that it was a relatively prosperous city. The architects, the planners, the entrepreneurs and the politicians became the builders of a brave new world. They boldly swept away the worst of the old slums, gleefully surveyed their raw material, and began to plan the motorway city of the 70s. As a counterbalance, they turned many parts of the city centre into pedestrian shopping precincts. Leeds was one of the 3 areas featured in the Buchanan report, and the city engineer was known to be sympathetic to Buchanan's ideas.
What possible pattern of roads and junctions could be devised for these dense 2,000 acres? One possibility was to have one-way roads making a series of hexagons. This is very efficient because it lessens the conflict of vehicles at road junctions. They don't get in each other's way. They tried this arrangement with 2 independent systems of one-way hexagons, the inner ones connecting directly to the main network outside. It could be made to work, but there'd be no chance at all of grafting such an arrangement onto the existing street layout.
What they decided on was a very sophisticated urban motorway system. It required a less drastic demolition program than the Buchanan scheme, but all the same, acres of housing had to be cleared. Conveniently enough, it was mainly slum housing. The scheme was encouraged and aided by government grants. The 1959 Highways Act had promised 75% of the cost of major road building. The design leaned heavily on European and American ideas. Tunnels, interchanges, and intersections borrowed straight from the autobahns and freeways. The promise of a beautiful new city, together with the package of slum clearance, forestalled any local opposition.
Slum clearance was often presented to us as a public health issue, pure and simple. But in fact, one of its prime motivations was for roadworks, especially urban motorways and things of that kind. You could almost say that the slum clearance machine was locked in with the road machine. Now, this is Hunslet. I can remember the old Hunslet. It was a very self-respecting community, back-to-backs mainly, very small houses. It was the community that was immortalised by Richard Hogarth in the uses of literacy in the 1950s. And this is Hunslet Grange that replaced the old Hunslet, an enormous council estate of about 1,200 flats. And Hunslet was cleared because we wanted to bring the M1 into Leeds. We were very proud of this at the time. We called ourselves the motorway city of the 70s, and it comes almost into the city centre. And so all around this estate you have these gigantic roadworks, the M1, the slip roads, and to a large extent on some sides it's an island. You can only reach it if you're a pedestrian by crossing over rather fragile looking footbridges.
Here in France, we have invented a machine to make cooking as simple as 1, 2, 3. Or, as we say in France, as simple as RoboChef. Make pastry, it's as simple as RoboChef. Chop meat, it's as simple as RoboChef. Slide and shred, it's as simple as RoboChef. RoboChef is powerful, quiet, simple. For the real pleasure of cooking, buy a RoboChef today. Thank you.
The Rolling Stones, the world's most outrageously successful group. 30 of their very best tracks, including all their #1 hits. Last, the story of the world's greatest rock and roll band. Amazing value, 30 great tracks. The story of the Stones, out now.
From Braun comes the first curling tong and styling brush, self-powered by butane. The Braun Independent Cordless Stylers. Style your hair whenever you want to, wherever you need to. The new Braun Independent Stylers.
If anyone says to me, José Ignacio Domecq, what is the true taste of sherry? I point to the chalky soil needed to grow the finest sherry grapes. You must not forget my family's 250 years experience and skill. And lastly, I might modestly mention my nose for blending, recognized throughout the world. For sherry is Domecq, and the true taste of sherry is Domecq Double Century.
Create a sensation. Miss Dior.
I was chatting to some Californians recently about Paul Masson's California Carafe. Paul Masson, they inform me, has been laying fine wines on people since 1852. Try a carafe, they suggested. See how it grabs you, man. Though somewhat wary of being grabbed by a bottle of wine, I decided to give it a whirl. And I must say, they're really jolly good.
Paul Masson's California Carafes, they're really jolly good.